The sun over Redemption Creek was a merciless hammer, beating down on the alkali dust until it rose in shimmering curtains, stinging the eyes and coating the back of the throat. It was a sun that bleached the color from everything it touched, the clapboard buildings that groaned under its relentless heat, the hopes of the men who toiled beneath it, and the worn fabric of Eleanor Whitfield's dress. She stood inside Patchett's mercantile, the air thick with the scent of dried beans, oiled leather, and the slow decay of a town gasping for breath. In her palms, slick with nervous sweat, lay her last few coins. They were not enough for medicine, not enough for passage to a better place, but just enough, perhaps, for a small sack of flour. Her children, Clara Jessie and little Ruthie, waited outside, their small faces pressed against the grimy window, a silent, heartbreaking tableau of need. Eleanor's internal monologue was a frantic prayer, a desperate calculation of survival. The flour would make bread. The bread would last 3 days, maybe 4, if she made the portion small enough. After that, the abyss she had been skirting for months would finally swallow them whole. "Well, Mrs. Whitfield," Mr. Patchett's voice was as dry as the dust outside his eyes, small and hard behind his spectacles. "Buying or browsing, my time ain't free." Eleanor flinched, her cheeks flushing with a familiar heat. Shame was a constant companion these days. "The flour, please, Mr. Patchett." Her voice was a bare whisper. She pushed the coins across the worn wooden counter. He scooped them up without a word, his expression making it clear he considered the transaction an act of charity he deeply resented. As he turned to weigh the flour, a sudden commotion erupted from the street. A horse whinnied in panic, followed by the sharp, definitive crack of a gunshot that shattered the afternoon's oppressive stillness. Then came the screams. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, just as the doors of the Redemption Creek Bank across the street burst open. 2 masked men emerged, rifles leveled, backing out onto the boardwalk. A third man, tall and broad-shouldered, followed them, a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He moved with a chilling, unhurried grace, his face obscured by a dark bandana. But it was the 4th man who held the town's terrified gaze. He was not masked. He stood on the bank's top step, his elegant tailored coat a stark contrast to the grit of the town. His hair was dark, his face handsome in a sharp, predatory way. He surveyed the street with an air of theatrical command, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. This was Malachi Thorne, a name whispered in fearful tones from dusty saloons to isolated homesteads. He was a phantom, a gentleman bandit who robbed with surgical precision and unnerving charm. "My dear citizens of Redemption Creek." Thorne's voice was rich and clear, carrying easily across the unnaturally silent street. "A momentary inconvenience, I assure you. Consider this a redistribution of wealth. Your diligent banker has agreed to make a contribution to a cause far greater than his own profits." Panic seized Eleanor, her children. She stumbled toward the mercantile door, her only thought to shield them from the unfolding violence. As she pushed it open, one of Thorne's men, a wiry, twitchy figure with a jagged scar above his right eye, was shoving terrified townsfolk off the boardwalk. His wild eyes landed on Eleanor, or rather, on the glint of silver at her throat. Before she could react, he lunged. His grimy hand shot out, calloused fingers closing around the delicate chain of her locket. It was her last treasure, the final gift from her late husband, Daniel. It held tiny portraits of them on their wedding day, a fragile link to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. No, the cry was torn from her, a raw sound of pure anguish. The man ignored her plea. With a vicious tug, he ripped the locket from her neck. The chain snapped, searing a thin red line across her skin. The pain was nothing compared to the violation, the feeling of having her last piece of sacred memory desecrated by this brute. He grinned, his teeth yellowed, and stuffed the locket into his vest pocket as if it were a common trinket. Eleanor stood frozen, the world narrowing to the empty space on her chest where the locket used to lie. The stolen money, the town's fear, the shadow of Malachi Thorne, it all faded. The robbery was no longer a random act of violence. It was personal. It was a desecration. In that moment, something shifted within her. The desperate, grieving widow was consumed by a cold, hard resolve. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the one thing they could not take her past. Thorne mounted his horse, his gaze sweeping over the scene with the satisfaction of a conductor finishing a masterpiece. His men followed suit, and with a final, almost polite tip of his hat to the terror-stricken town, and they spurred their horses and galloped away, swallowed by the same dust that seemed to breathe the town's despair. The aftermath was a study in shock. People emerged slowly like prairie dogs from their burrows, their voices a low trembling murmur. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary posture suggested he had lost the fight with this town long ago, stood by the bank's shattered door, looking utterly outmatched. His young deputy, a boy named Finn, with earnest eyes and a jaw still soft with youth, was trying to restore order, his voice cracking with a nervous energy that inspired little confidence. Eleanor barely heard them. She gathered her children, who were crying in confused fear, her movements stiff and automatic. The flour was forgotten. The hunger was forgotten. All that remained was the burning line on her neck and the hollow ache in her heart. They had taken everything. As she stood adrift in the sea of chaos, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a man whose stillness was a stark contrast to the surrounding panic. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, his face a landscape of quiet hardship. His storm-gray eyes, shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat, held a gravity that seemed to pull the world into focus. It was Silas Boone, a local rancher known more for his silence than his sociability. He was a man who kept to himself, his land a fortress against the world. He looked from her face to her children, then back again. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, cutting through the noise. "The man who took your locket," he said, his words deliberate, not a question, but a statement of fact being confirmed. "Did he have a scar above his right eye?" Eleanor stared at him, stunned into silence. How could he possibly know? She could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something ancient and cold passed through his eyes. He didn't offer condolences or empty reassurances. He simply looked at her, at the raw desperation that she no longer had the strength to hide, and made a decision. "You and the children can't stay in town tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My wagon is by the feed store. Get your things." It wasn't an offer of charity. It felt like a summons, a command born from a place of shared history she couldn't begin to comprehend. Confused, terrified, but clinging to this unexpected anchor in the storm, Eleanor gathered her children's hands. She didn't know who Silas Boone was, not really. But in his perceptive question and the grim certainty in his eyes, she sensed a connection to the violence that had just shattered her world. For the first time all day, a flicker of something other than despair ignited within her, a dangerous, fragile hope. The hope that the path to reclaiming her past had just unexpectedly appeared before her. The ride to Silas Boone's ranch was a silent one, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft, exhausted whimpers of Ruthie, who had finally cried herself to sleep in Eleanor's arms. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the vast, empty prairie in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was a beautiful, lonely landscape, that offered no comfort, only a sense of profound scale that made her own suffering feel both insignificant and all-encompassing. Silas handled the reins with a quiet competence, his gaze fixed on the darkening plains ahead. He hadn't spoken another word since his terse instruction in town, and the silence that enveloped them was heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor studied his profile against the fading light, the square set of his jaw, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He was a man who seemed carved from the very land he worked, solid and unyielding. Yet his question about the scar haunted her. It was too specific to be a coincidence. The Boone Ranch materialized from the twilight, not a grand estate, but a testament to stubborn persistence. The cabin was plain, but sturdy, its logs darkened by weather and time. A plume of wood smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcome beacon in the growing chill. On the porch sat a woman, whose posture was as rigid as the straight-backed chair she occupied. This was Martha Boone Silas's widowed mother, a woman whose sharp eyes and tightly pressed lips seemed to be in a permanent state of disapproval. As Silas helped Eleanor and the children down from the wagon, Martha rose. Her gaze swept over them, and Eleanor felt herself being measured and found wanting. The judgment was as palpable as the evening cold. Martha's voice was crisp, like dry leaves skittering across hard ground. "What is this?" "They're staying," Silas replied, his tone final. He began unhitching the horses, his back to both women, effectively ending the conversation. Martha's lips thinned, but she turned and ushered them inside with a brisk, impatient gesture. The warmth of the cabin was the first thing Eleanor registered. It seeped into her bones, a startling comfort after the raw exposure of the day. The air smelled of cedar coffee and something savory simmering on the stove. Without a word of welcome, Martha ladled stew into 3 small bowls and set them on the table for the children. Clara and Jessie, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of such a miracle, fell upon the food with a desperate hunger that made Eleanor's throat tighten. Ruthie, still half asleep, clutched a piece of cornbread in her small fist. Eleanor remained standing, her hands clasped before her, feeling like an intruder, a beggar, who had overstepped some invisible boundary. "Eat," Martha commanded, her voice not unkind, but stripped of all sentiment. She gestured to a 4th bowl on the table. Eleanor obeyed, sitting stiffly. Each spoonful of the rich, warm stew was a reminder of her failure, a testament to her inability to provide this simple comfort for her own family. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not show weakness in this house. Silas entered, moving with a quiet economy that seemed to fill the small cabin. He poured milk for the children, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle, as he steadied Ruthie's tipping cup. He ate standing by the hearth, his plate resting on the mantelpiece, his presence a silent, watchful weight in the room. His silence was no longer empty. It felt purposeful, as if he were listening for something only he could hear. That night, tucked into a small, clean room that smelled of dried lavender, Eleanor lay awake long after her children's soft breaths had settled into a steady rhythm. The day's events played over and over in her mind. The shattering glass, the cruel grin of the man, with the scar, the searing pain, as the locket was ripped from her neck. And through it all, Silas Boone's strange, knowing question. Unable to rest, she rose and padded to the window. The moon was high, casting a silver sheen over the ranch. And there by the corral fence was Silas. He stood alone, hat in hand, looking out into the dark fields as if searching for something he had lost. There was a profound loneliness in his stance, a solitary grief that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest. He was a man guarding a secret, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that his secret and her stolen locket were somehow intertwined. The following days fell into a strange, unspoken routine. Eleanor rose before dawn, determined to earn her keep. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, and helped Martha in the garden, working with a frantic energy fueled by a mixture of gratitude and pride. Martha watched her with those sharp, discerning eyes, her demeanor slowly softening from outright suspicion to a grudging acceptance. The children, meanwhile, began to heal. The haunted look in their eyes was replaced by the simple, uncomplicated joy of chasing chickens and gathering wildflowers. They were safe. And for that, Eleanor would endure anything. Silas remained a remote figure, leaving for the fields at sunrise and returning after dusk. Yet Eleanor felt his presence everywhere. A stack of kindling left neatly by the door, a pail of fresh, cool water from the well waiting for her in the morning. Small, silent acts of consideration that spoke louder than any words of comfort. 2 weeks after the robbery, Malachi Thorne returned to Redemption Creek. He did not ride in with guns blazing, but arrived in a polished carriage dressed not as an outlaw, but as a prosperous investor. He used the very money he had stolen from the bank to purchase the town's failing businesses, including the deed to the only reliable well. With a flourish of false sincerity, he announced his intention to revitalize the town, promising prosperity and security. He offered loans to desperate ranchers and store credit at the mercantile he now owned. The town, broken and desperate, was seduced. Sheriff Brody, powerless and outmaneuvered, could only watch as Thorne wrapped his silken fingers around Redemption Creek's throat. But Eleanor saw the truth. This wasn't business. It was a siege. Thorne was systematically seizing control, and his charming smile did little to hide the cold, calculating ambition in his eyes. Driven by a need for answers, Eleanor began her own quiet investigation. She sought out Deputy Finn, whose youthful idealism had not yet been crushed by the town's cynicism. He listened to her story, his brow furrowed with concern. "The man with the scar," Finn said, flipping through a stack of wanted posters. "Sounds like Jedediah Kane. A nasty piece of work. Rode with Thorne for years." He paused, looking at her with sympathy. "Mrs. Whitfield, that locket. It's likely been sold or melted down by now. Trying to find it is a fool's errand." "It's not a fool's errand to me." Deputy Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "It's all I have left of my husband." Her words sparked a new thought. Daniel? He had been a simple farmer, a good man who had worked himself into an early grave, trying to build a life for them on a small rented plot of land. Or so she had thought. Could there be a connection? It seemed impossible, but Silas's question lingered in her mind. That night, after the children were asleep, she went through the small wooden chest that held Daniel's few remaining possessions, a worn Bible, a handful of letters from his family back east, and his old work clothes. Tucked into the lining of his winter coat, her fingers brushed against something she had never felt before. A small leather-bound journal, its pages warped and stained by water. Her heart pounded as she carried it to the faint light of a lantern. The ink was faded, the handwriting barely legible in places. But as she began to read, her world tilted on its axis. The entries were from years before they had met, from a time in Daniel's life he had never spoken of. They told of a partnership, a shared dream of striking it rich in a silver mine called the Morning Star. And the names of his partners were there, written in faded black ink. Silas Boone, and a charismatic, ambitious man he called Mal. A single entry dated nearly a decade ago made her blood run cold. A terrible day. The west tunnel collapsed. Mal is blaming us. He says we were negligent, that we cut corners on the support beams to get to the new vein faster. Silas and we cannot face what happened. We told the authorities it was a natural shift in the rock. God forgive us for the lies, but the truth is too much to bear. Mal has lost everything. His hatred is a fire that will consume us all. Eleanor stared at the page, her hands trembling. Daniel, her gentle, honest Daniel, had been partners with Silas Boone and Malachi Thorne. He had been part of a terrible secret, a lie buried deep in an abandoned mine. The robbery, the locket, Silas's silence, it all snapped into a terrifying, coherent picture. Thorne wasn't just robbing a town. He had returned to settle an old score. And she and her children were now standing in the heart of a storm that had been gathering for 10 long years. Her quest for a stolen piece of jewelry had become a desperate search for the truth of her own husband's past. A past that was far darker and more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The flickering lantern light cast long dancing shadows across the cabin walls, turning the familiar room into a place of secrets. Eleanor sat with Daniel's journal open in her lap, the faded words a testament to a life she had never known. The man she had loved and mourned, the simple farmer, was gone. In his place was a stranger, a man who had harbored a dark, guilt-ridden secret, a man connected to the very villain who was now strangling the life out of Redemption Creek. The weight of this new reality was crushing, yet it was also clarifying. Her grief, once a passive, sorrowful thing, was sharpening into a weapon. The next morning she found Silas by the barn, mending a harness, his hands moving with practiced, methodical calm. She held the journal out to him, her own hand not quite steady. "You need to tell me everything," she said, her voice low but firm. No more silence. Silas looked from the journal to her face, and for the first time she saw the mask of stoicism crack. The storm-gray eyes were clouded with a deep, weary pain. He took the journal, his calloused thumb tracing the worn leather cover as if touching a ghost. "I was hoping you'd never have to know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He led her to a bench overlooking the vast expanse of his land, and as the morning sun climbed higher, he began to speak. He told her about the Morning Star mine, the heady excitement of the Silver Strike, and the easy friendship between the three partners. Daniel, the steady, hard-working heart of the operation. Silas, the quiet, watchful strength. And Malachi Mal Thorne, the charming, silver-tongued visionary who had secured the investors and dreamed of building an empire. Thorne was different then. Silas said, his gaze lost in the past. Ambitious, yes, but he had a wife, a young son. He brought them out to the mining camp. He loved them more than anything. Then he spoke of the collapse. His voice grew strained, heavy with a guilt that had clearly corroded his soul for a decade. There was a new vein, richer than anything we'd ever seen. Mal wanted to get to it fast. Daniel and we were more cautious. We argued about reinforcing the West Tunnel. Mal saw it as a delay. We saw it as necessary. He paused, swallowing hard. The day it happened, Mal's wife Isabella had brought his son Thomas to the mine to bring him lunch. They were in the foreman's shack right at the mouth of the West Tunnel. Silas's voice dropped to a whisper. The ground just gave way. A sound like the world tearing apart. We got out, but the tunnel entrance was gone, buried under 1,000 tons of rock. Isabella and Thomas were gone with it. Eleanor felt a chill creep over her, despite the morning heat. The journal says, Thorne blamed you and Daniel. Silas nodded, not meeting her eyes. He said we caused it, that we deliberately used substandard timbers to save money and time. It wasn't true. It was a tragic, awful accident. But in his grief, it was the only thing that made sense to him. We tried to reason with him, but he was mad with sorrow. He accused us of murder. And the lie. Eleanor pressed her heart, aching for the weight he had carried alone for so long. Daniel wrote that you lied to the authorities. We were scared. Silas confessed the words raw and painful. Thorne was a powerful man, even then. His grief was so potent, so convincing. We were afraid no one would believe it was an accident. We feared we'd be charged, lose everything. So we stuck to the story that it was a natural geological event. We covered our tracks. It was a coward's choice, and I've lived with it every single day since. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. Daniel couldn't bear the guilt. He wanted to start over, be a simple man, forget the silver and the ghosts. I stayed. This land was my penance. I knew one day Thorn would come back. I just didn't know he'd come for you too. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thorn's vendetta wasn't about money. It was about revenge. A deep, festering wound that had poisoned him for 10 years. He wasn't seizing control of Redemption Creek for profit. He was building a gallows for Silas Boone. This new knowledge changed everything. In the weeks that followed, a tense, unspoken alliance formed between Eleanor and Silas. They were bound together by the shared secrets of the past. The dynamic in the house shifted as well. Martha Boone, sensing the gravity of the situation, shed her frosty demeanor. She saw the grim determination in Eleanor's eyes and the crushing weight on her son's shoulders, and her maternal instincts took over. The cabin became a fortress, the three adults united against the gathering storm. Thorn's grip on the town tightened. He foreclosed on ranchers who couldn't pay his exorbitant water fees, his men riding out to seize livestock and land. He made a public show of offering Silas a generous price for his ranch. Just a simple business proposition, Boone Thorn had said, his voice dripping with false civility during a tense encounter in the now Thorn-owned mercantile. Your land holds nothing but old ghosts. Let me take them off your hands. Silas had refused his one-word answer, no, as solid and unmovable as a mountain. Thorn's smile never faltered, but his eyes were chips of ice. Every man has something he isn't willing to lose. He'd replied, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward Eleanor and the children who stood a short distance away. The veiled threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Eleanor knew they couldn't just wait for Thorn to make his final move. She spent her evenings poring over Daniel's journal, studying the crude, hand-drawn maps of the Morning Star mine. She memorized the layout of the tunnels, the geological notations, the warnings about unstable sections. If the conflict was to end where it began, she would not be unprepared. Knowledge was the only weapon she possessed. The second obstacle came not in the form of a direct confrontation, but a slow, cruel strangulation. Thorn, angered by Silas's defiance, cut off the water supply to the Boone Ranch. The creek that ran through Silas's property was fed by the spring Thorn now controlled. Within days, the flow dwindled to a muddy trickle. The cattle grew thirsty, their lowing a constant mournful complaint. The garden withered under the relentless sun. They were an island, and the sea was draining away. The townspeople, now beholden to Thorn for their own survival, shunned them. Mr. Patchett refused to sell them supplies. Old neighbors turned their heads when they passed. They were alone. It was during this siege that Eleanor's resolve hardened into steel. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a combatant. She helped Silas haul water by the bucket from a small brackish seep at the far end of his property, a back-breaking task that lasted from dawn until dusk. She rationed food with a miser's precision. She taught her children to be quiet, to be watchful, to understand the nature of the unseen enemy who was trying to starve them out. One evening, as she stood watching the sky turn the color of a fresh bruise, a sign of the coming sandstorm, when the old-timers had predicted, she felt a profound shift within herself. She was not just fighting for her children's future anymore. She was fighting for Daniel's honor to redeem the cowardly choice he had made. And she was fighting for Silas, the silent, honorable man who had taken them in and was now paying the price for a decade-old sin. The wind began to pick up, whipping her hair across her face and whistling a mournful tune around the eaves of the cabin. It sounded like a warning. The final act was about to begin. The sandstorm arrived like a malevolent beast, swallowing the prairie in a roiling, ochre-colored cloud. The wind howled, a monstrous, keening thing that rattled the cabin's shutters and drove fine grains of sand through every crack and crevice. The world outside was erased, replaced by a suffocating, churning chaos. It was under the cover of this elemental fury that Thorn made his move. Eleanor was securing a loose shutter when she saw them, 3 riders, barely visible through the swirling dust, their forms like ghostly apparitions. Her blood ran cold. She screamed for Silas, who was in the barn reinforcing the doors against the gale. But it was too late. By the time Silas burst out of the barn, a pitchfork in his hands, Thorn and his men were at the cabin. Jedediah Kane, the man with the scar, grabbed Jesse from the porch where he'd been playing. The boy's terrified cry was nearly swallowed by the wind. Thorn dismounted and, eerily calm amidst the tempest, held up a hand. "No closer, Boone," he called out, his voice cutting through the roar. "This has gone on long enough." Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Her eyes were locked on Jesse, who struggled futilely in Kane's iron grip. "Let him go, Thorn." Silas said, his voice a low growl of pure menace. "This is between you and me." Thorn laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. "Oh, it has always been between you and me. But you seem to require a more potent motivation." He gestured toward the raging storm. "The morning star mine. Midnight. Come alone. We will conclude our business where it began." He mounted his horse, and without another word, the riders dissolved back into the storm, taking Jesse with them. The sound of Eleanor's choked sob was the only thing left in their wake. Panic gave way to a cold, terrible fury. This was it, the culmination of 10 years of festering hatred. Silas looked at her, his face a mask of anguish and self-loathing. "This is my fault," he rasped. "No," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but resolute. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "This is our fault. Daniel's yours and now mine. And we will finish it. Together." She ran inside and returned with Daniel's journal. "I know the mine," she said, her eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "I've studied the maps. There are other ways in old ventilation shafts Thorn won't be expecting." For the next hour, as the storm raged around them, they planned. There would be no walking into Thorn's trap. They would use the storm, the darkness, and her knowledge as their weapons. Silas armed himself with a rifle and a heavy axe. Eleanor took a lantern and a small sharp knife she had tucked away from the kitchen. As they prepared to leave, Martha grabbed Eleanor's hand, her own eyes fierce. "Bring that boy home," she commanded. The journey to the mine was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, the sand scouring their skin and blinding them. They navigated by instinct and memory, the familiar landscape transformed into a hostile, alien world. The abandoned mine was a gaping maw in the side of a hill, its entrance shored up by rotting timbers that groaned under the assault of the storm. As Silas created a diversion at the main entrance, drawing the attention of Thorn's men, Eleanor slipped away into the howling darkness. She found the ventilation shaft Daniel had marked on his map, a narrow, uninviting hole half choked with debris. Without hesitation, she lowered herself into the earth, and the darkness swallowing her whole. The air inside was stale and cold, the silence a stark contrast to the screaming wind above. Her small lantern cast flickering shadows on the damp rock walls. Following the map from memory, she navigated the labyrinthine tunnels, her every sense on high alert. Finally, she saw a faint light ahead and heard voices. She crept forward, peering around a corner into a larger cavern. Thorn was there, standing before a makeshift fire. Jesse was tied to a support beam, his face tear-streaked but defiant. Jedediah Kane stood guard. Thorn was holding something in his hand, turning it over and over in the firelight. It was her locket. It was a beautiful thing, wasn't it? Thorn said, his voice echoing in the chamber. He wasn't speaking to Jesse or Kane. He was speaking to the ghosts that haunted the mine. Daniel gave this to my Isabella. A wedding gift. See the inscription, he held it up. My guiding star. He said it was because her name Isabella meant as much to him as the mine we were to call the Morning Star. Poetic, wasn't he? He turned his cold gaze on Jesse. Your father, boy, was a thief and a murderer. He and Silas Boone wanted the silver all for themselves. They saw the new vein, and they knew my share would make them slightly less rich. So they weakened the supports. They buried my wife and my son alive for a few extra dollars. The lie was so absolute, so poisoned with a decade of grief, that it had become his truth. This was not about revenge for negligence. In his mind, it was retribution for cold-blooded murder. And now, Thorn said softly, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, Silas will watch his new family die in the same cursed ground. He will feel what I felt, the helplessness, the loss. And then this whole miserable place will be his tomb. At that moment, the sound of gunfire erupted from the mine entrance. Silas had begun his assault. Kane spun around, rifle at the ready. Stay with the boy, Thorn commanded, drawing his own pistol and striding toward the tunnel. This was her chance. As Kane's attention was divided, Eleanor lunged from the shadows. She brought a heavy rock down on the back of his head with all her strength. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. She rushed to Jesse, her knife flashing as she sliced through the ropes. Mama, he cried, throwing his arms around her neck. We have to go now, she whispered, pulling him toward a side tunnel. But Thorn had heard the commotion. He reappeared at the cavern entrance, his face contorted in a mask of fury. You, he snarled, raising his pistol. Suddenly, a deep groaning sound echoed through the mine. The gunfire, combined with the pressure of the storm outside, had done its work. The old timbers began to crack. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The entire structure was becoming unstable. Silas appeared behind Thorn, his face grim, the axe in his hand. It's over, Mal, he yelled over the noise. The mine is coming down. Thorn laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. Then we all die together. A fitting end. He fired at Silas, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall. Eleanor grabbed Jesse's hand and pulled him into the side tunnel she had memorized from Daniel's map, a narrow passage that led to the surface on the far side of the hill. This way, she screamed to Silas. Silas engaged Thorn not with the rifle, but with the axe, using it to bring down a critical support beam. Rocks and earth began to cascade down, sealing the main tunnel and cutting Thorn off. Silas scrambled back, diving toward the passage where Eleanor and Jesse were waiting, just as the roof of the main cavern collapsed with a deafening roar. They ran stumbling through the darkness, the sounds of the dying mine chasing them. They could feel the vibrations through the soles of their feet as the earth reclaimed what man had stolen from it. Finally, they saw a sliver of gray, chaotic light. They clawed their way up the final incline and burst out into the raging sandstorm, gasping for breath, covered in dust and grime, but alive. Together. Behind them, the Morning Star mine. When the source of so much wealth, grief, and hatred was silent. It had become a tomb just as Thorn had wished, but it was his own. He and his ghosts were buried at last. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died down to a whisper, and the sun rose on a world scrubbed clean, the light soft and forgiving. As Eleanor, Silas, and Jesse trudged back toward the ranch, the silence between them was not one of tension or secrets, but of shared exhaustion and profound relief. They found Martha on the porch, a rifle across her lap, her face etched with worry that melted into overwhelming joy at the sight of them. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional fallout was just beginning. Later that day, as the children slept, their small bodies finally succumbing to the ordeal, Eleanor and Silas sat at the kitchen table. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of all that had happened. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice hoarse. He told her the full, unvarnished truth, the part Daniel had left out of his journal. The collapse was an accident, he said, his eyes fixed on his hands. But the argument we had that morning, it was about more than just the timbers. Mal accused us of being too slow, of costing him money. Daniel, he lost his temper. He said that Mal's greed would get them all killed. They were shouting. It was ugly. When the collapse happened, when we realized Isabella and Thomas were gone, the guilt was unbearable. We felt responsible not for causing it, but for letting things get so heated, for not being able to stop it. He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with a decade of unshed tears. We ran, Eleanor. We were cowards. We buried the truth because we couldn't face what was in our own hearts. That fear, that lie, it's what let Mal's hatred grow into the monster it became. If we had faced him, then told the truth, maybe none of this would have happened. Eleanor listened, her heart aching for the flawed, frightened men they had been. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. There was no judgment in her touch, only a deep, sorrowful understanding. Daniel was not the perfect saint she had enshrined in her memory, but a man who had made a terrible mistake out of fear. And Silas was not just a silent, stoic rancher, but a man who had chosen to live a life of lonely penance. Acknowledging their flaws did not diminish her love for one or her growing respect for the other. It made them real. In that moment of shared truth, the last walls between them crumbled. Their bond was no longer forged in gratitude or shared danger, but in the bedrock of mutual forgiveness. Months passed. The prairie healed from the storm, and life on the Boone Ranch settled into a new, more hopeful rhythm. Redemption Creek, freed from Thorn's oppressive grip, slowly began to breathe again. Deputy Finn was made the new sheriff, his youthful earnestness now tempered with a quiet authority. One clear autumn afternoon, Eleanor took the children to the small windswept hill where Daniel was buried. Silas came with them. The air was crisp, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The children, fully recovered, played a short distance away, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Eleanor stood before the simple wooden cross, her silver locket in her hand. Silas had found it in the dust outside the collapsed mine, its surface scratched, but its clasp unbroken. For weeks she had kept it tucked away, unsure of what it now represented. It was a symbol of her love for Daniel, but also of his secrets and the terrible price of his fear. She opened the clasp. The tiny portraits of her and Daniel on their wedding day stared back at her, their faces full of a hope so pure it almost hurt to see. She thought of the man in the picture and the man in the journal. They were the same person, a good man who had been broken by tragedy and had made a poor choice, but whose love for her and the children had been the truest thing in his life. She could hold both truths now. With a gentle reverence, she did not discard the locket or bury it. Instead, she hung it carefully over the top of the wooden cross. It was an offering, an act of honoring the love that had been while simultaneously releasing the secrets and the pain that had been chained to it. She was letting go not of the man, but of the ghost. She felt a quiet peace settle over her, a sense of closure that was both sorrowful and liberating. She turned away from the grave and saw Silas watching her. His storm-gray eyes filled with a gentle understanding. He held out his hand. Eleanor took it. His grip was warm and strong, an anchor in the present, a promise for the future. Together they walked back toward the ranch, toward the sound of their children's laughter as their faces turned toward the setting sun. They were not escaping the past, but walking forward with it, two scarred but resilient souls, building a new life on the hard-won ground of forgiveness and truth.